Chapter 2. Waking up was a long, painful process with no beginning and no real end. It was a long period where pain and nausea encompassed the totality of Haddad's world. Never had he felt such sickness as his body pitched and moved against his will. Several times, he could not have said how many, the nausea provoked an episode where he tried to vomit. Haddad never did, but each bout wiped out any progress he made towards reaching normalcy, and pain blotted out his sense of time. Finally, he mastered his illness and tried to call for help. His eyes were gummy and his mouth and throat were dry. It was only after he was sitting up and looking at the moving landscape that he remembered the Keldon attack. The moment he went down. Commands and voices he had never heard brought him fully into the present.
"Slave! That one is too ill for the purpose. Find another to use."
The voice was gravelly but quiet and with a feminine tone. The voice spoke in Haddad's native tongue, but the words sounded foreign, as if whoever was speaking them hadn't known the language for very long. He turned his head slowly to see the speaker. It was a Keldon, but this one was different from the warriors he had seen charging the line. She was a woman, 6 feet tall and dressed in dyed leathers. The red and orange tones were bright and jarring to his eyes. Her features were coarse, and her gray skin was wet ash in the shadows of the vehicle. She turned and looked at him with eyes rimmed with kohl. A hand shoved his head, and his vision clouded at the fresh pain. The cursing he heard became shouts of anger behind him. A struggle was occurring, and he turned to see what was happening. He found a man of his own nation crouched by him. The poor state of his clothes and the resignation in his body were obvious even to Haddad's still blurry vision. This was a man who had been with the Keldons far longer than Haddad cared to imagine. "Don't look at him directly, boy," the man said as he looked off to the left of Haddad's face. Haddad tried to see what was happening as the sounds of struggle died down. The brightly clad woman was standing in front of a League officer restrained by 2 men. His mouth was bleeding, and as he bared his teeth in challenge. The Keldon smashed his face with her gloves, which were heavy and studded. He fell to his knees, and the 2 men kept his head bowed as he began cursing in broken, incoherent mutterings. "He challenged her with his eyes. Never meet their eyes. Now she'll make him suffer." All this was delivered by the crouching man in a low voice that Haddad strained to hear as he looked around. He must be in one of the large vehicles he had seen on the battlefield, Haddad thought. He was on a long deck that stretched maybe 60 feet from end to end. One side of the vehicle opened to the outside through several large doors which allowed light inside. The landscape flowed by at a fair clip, and Haddad realized motion sickness contributed to his nausea. The vehicle he was in was packed with League prisoners. The captives were lying down, and only a few were not obviously injured or dazed. There were only a small group of what must be Kelvin's servants, all raggedly dressed men. They seemed rather stoic at the Keldon victory, and Haddad wondered what their status really was. Loud horns sounded outside the vehicle, and Haddad felt a moment of hope as he imagined it signaling the arrival of League forces.
"Hold his hand still,"
the alien woman said. Both servants rammed the officer's hand to the deck, and Haddad wanted to protest, but he couldn't drag a single sound from his parched throat. The woman drew back her metal-shod stave and then slammed it down on the man's fingers. The officer inhaled to scream, but he reared his head up, staring into her eyes. Before he could voice his pain, the stave rose and crushed his other hand. He did not scream, but seemed to dissolve into the wooden deck. When the woman spoke, she didn't even sound angry.
"Over to the side with him."
She gestured to an opening, and the body was flung clear.
"Walking speed in a wide circle,"
she called, and the command was relayed by others, presumably carrying it to the driver of the craft. The passage of landscape slowed, and Haddad became more aware of the craft's curious gait. He could see other vehicles moving in his line of sight as the craft began to turn. The image that sprang to mind was of hermit crabs using toy boats as shells. The vehicles were overturned hulls and shapes with wide doors and windows showing. He could see the gray faces of Keldons in contrast with the captives, looking out. The land vehicles were balanced on dozens of legs, and the rhythmical sight of them made his motion sickness worse as the female Keldon spoke.
"I am Latella, and you will obey."
she said loudly, but without any particular emphasis.
I will not be questioned or challenged. All other Keldons will receive the same obedience and respect, or you will be punished.
Hadad watched other men being thrown from what he decided to call land barges. Some were limp and did not rise. Others got up and started collecting themselves.
Some of you might be thinking of escape. Try and you will be punished, and I punish the slave without respect. Even if you should succeed, you will only find death.
As she finished, Hadad could see groups of something breaking into the large circle of moving land barges. The timing was too perfect, and he realized he was seeing a planned performance, and not some impromptu expression of rage or cruelty. This was carefully staged, and only his weakness and passivity had saved him from a similar fate. The land birds of the wastes were now only a legend in the civilized cities in the League where Hadad had grown up. They had been relegated to the status of monsters of fairy tales, spoken of only to scare children. But in the wilds of the East, they were a primary danger faced by League patrols before the Keldons began raiding. They hunted in pairs or small groups, and their presence in the district meant panic. All that Hadad knew of the Pariah, called the Running Death by some, flowed through his mind. Then the beasts spread out and fell onto the men stumbling on the ground. The birds overtook their victims. When they reached the running men, they knocked them down with what appeared to be playful nudges of their beaks. Full-grown men fell and tumbled head over heels as a result of those love taps. Other birds snapped at flailing limbs and dismembered men as neatly and quickly as slaughtered chickens in the mess hall. More Pariah darted in, and Hadad wondered where they all had come from. At more than 500 pounds apiece, the surrounding landscape couldn't support many of the vicious birds. He coughed and spit several times before he could make a sound.
It's like a flock of sparrows hunting a field,
Hadad said. The juxtaposition of that homey memory against the hellish scene was grotesque.
Where are they all coming from?
He was talking to himself, but the crouching slave, that's what he must be, answered him.
Every trip they dispose of the troublemakers are dead here. The Pariah can sprint past a galloping horse and run for hours. They come from miles around whenever the Keldons enter the wastes. The Tulla takes advantage of the birds' hunger to shatter the spirits of the captives. I'd curse them all if I didn't know I'd end up out there.
The birds that strangled in found no moving prey and fell upon the bodies of the League officers and slaves. The unconscious victims mercifully died without seeing their devourers. The birds leapt and tore in a territorial display to keep other gorging birds away. Keldon warriors handled barbed lances to drive away birds that might come too near the barges. Another round of horns sounded.
The lesson is over. Let it never be forgotten,
the Tulla intoned. Hadad knew he would always remember and swore vengeance, but he swore it silently and with eyes cast down in apparent submission.
Into traveling column and trail speed,
she called, and was once again echoed to wherever the controller or helm was located. The barge straightened out, and Hadad's last view of the bloody scene was the Pariah snatching meat from each other's kills. Hadad sat morosely against the cavern wall, idly turning his mess kit in his hands as he dreamed of the next meal. The cave was shallow and dry, the wind blowing continuously into its mouth. One of many against a granite cliffside, it was stuffed with League soldiers and civilians captured by raiders. How long had he been in captivity, Hadad wondered. Like his distant slave ancestors, Hadad was cut off from time. Each day was the same. It started with sunrise and stopped with sunset. Hadad wondered how his forebears dealt with the total lack of control. He had no idea what would happen to him or when things might change. Latulla's barges had stopped within hours of the Pariah feeding. Hadad had stepped into a desolate valley ringed by sloping cliffs. The area served as a central collection and training point for the Keldons. Each load of humanity was dumped into this sewer and into slavery. The task of the overseers was to instruct new servants in the Keldon language. The turnover among prisoners and their teachers was constant. Hadad was sure it was to prevent escapes. It was impossible to plan anything or trust anyone as people appeared and disappeared without apparent reason. There was only one constant, the distribution of the food. A slave might have many instructors and sleep in many caves, but only one person would issue a captive's rations. The chit that Hadad carried continually locked in his fist was the only source of food besides the weeds growing in the arid soil. Twice a day he reported for food and spoke a few words of Keldon. If he showed no improvement in speaking, he received nothing. Some slaves starved to death as the world looked on, either for failure to learn or because they irritated the distributor of the food. Hadad had tried sharing rations, but the desperate stole what they could and Soon everyone bolted their food as soon as possible to avoid theft. Goblins, elves, league soldiers were all thrown together, locked in a desperate struggle to learn their captor's language. Each day was the same as bewildered captives arrived and apathetic slaves left. Haddad wondered if all of Jamuraa would be swallowed by similar camps. "Food call!" came a voice from outside the cave. The issue of rations motivated all the captives, and they rushed out of the caves where they talked with Keldon-speaking slaves. Piles of food were set up, and Haddad hurried to get into the nearest line. "I'm very hungry, and I need food so I might serve Keld," Haddad said as he reached the head of the line. The slave passing out the food nodded and handed him bread. "You've learned very quickly," the man said, "but continue to concentrate on speaking clearly." Haddad thought the threat of starvation centered the mind more surely than the slave's compliment. He retreated higher up and squatted to eat his ration. Most of the camp was congregated around the food, and guards moved in to keep order. Haddad could see a clump of new prisoners nearing the head of the line. The last load of captives have come from the south and brought lizard men and goblins to the camp. They were not yet broken by the turnover inside the prison. They still had their identities. The roar of the lizard men, as they fell on the guards, shocked the camp. Warriors began to retreat as more and more prisoners joined in the rush. Keldons rushed from throughout the camp as the captives turned on the captors. Spear tips tore into the prisoners, but like a stampede, the pressure of the ones behind pushed the dying forward, tangling weapons. "Come on!" cried Nelf as he began running toward the camp corrals. "We'll steal mounts and be gone before the bastards can put down the riot." Haddad followed. The corrals held a few mounts for scouts and were at the mouth of the valley. A slim chance is enough in this hell, he thought as he ran for the horses. A few other prisoners fell in behind him, but most of the population was converging on the clumps of embattled guards. The corrals grew closer and closer. Then the elf leading the run slowed, and Haddad crashed into him, both prisoners spilling to the ground. Haddad cursed his bleeding scrapes as he started to help his companion rise. The elf only shuddered, blood pouring from the arrow wound in his chest. Guards stood in front of the corrals, one with a bow in hand. The archer and his companions must have come from the feed sheds to the side of the corral. Haddad watched him pick off one of the prisoners who stumbled to a halt as the Keldon guards unsheathed their swords. Haddad turned and slowly walked away. He headed up towards the caves. If the riot pulled more warriors away from their stations, a guard post might be abandoned at the top of the cliffs. But even as Haddad walked the back slope, he could see the attack dying down. The fighting retreat of the Keldons stopped with the guards pinned back against the sheds. The building stored gear for the raiding parties. Suddenly, new figures entered the fight. Axes and swords cut through walls to fall upon prisoners. The new defenders were red and the riot began dying. Literally. Swords sheared men into pieces, and instead of the new fighters being buried under bodies, they mounted piles of corpses. Crazed captives lost their footing on the blood-soaked ground. Insane charges momentarily hid the scarlet fighters, but steel cleared away the curtain of flesh to reveal them anew. Now the prisoners broke and ran for the caves. The guards paused to bind up their wounds, and their allies all stopped. Like machines, Haddad thought. Then the fleeing tide of captives was upon him. He ran toward the cliffside with the rest. The riot had failed, and who knew what the Keldons would do? Haddad moved into the cave and crawled into a high ledge right by the entrance. More people poured in, and Haddad wondered if some might die of the crush in the back. Finally, the stream of people stopped. Haddad slowly got down and looked out the entrance. Keldon warriors were spreading out as land barges came from outside the camp. Guards began clearing out the caves and herding prisoners into the waiting transportation. The few supervising slaves that had been caught up in the riot called out, "What's happening? We're innocent!" The language teachers were lost among the rioters. Haddad wondered if they would share the fate of the rebellious students. "The camp is being cleared out to the main colony," a guard called back, blood clotting on his armor. Everything was being loaded aboard the barges, Haddad realized, as if the bloody riot had been a graduation ceremony. The Keldons were shipping the prisoners onward. Haddad stepped out of the cave, wondering if it was all a trap, if the guards were lulling them forward to take their vengeance. But their blows were no different from their usual brutality, and Haddad stumbled forward with a ringing head and the hope that he was headed somewhere better.